Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of Hammer Time. Now, originally I planned an episode today on energy policy featuring the fantastic Substack writers of Doomberg, but given the current events in the United Kingdom, I decided to go in a slightly different direction. So consider this a little bit of a Hammer Time special, if you will. But before I do so, as always, I really want to thank all of you who stopped by on audio platforms, on YouTube, on X, to take a look or to listen to entire episodes. I'm very happy to report that due to the fact that so many of you did so, that in the next 2 weeks I'll have Konstantin Kisin on my show and I have a couple of other high caliber guests. So I think the quality of this podcast is going to increase with every episode, and this would not be possible without your continued support. So please subscribe, like, leave your comments. As you can see, I try to reply to as many comments as possible. I definitely read every single one of them, so I'm always very happy to interact with you as much as possible. As always, also today, I won't have a guest at the end of today's show, but next time, again, it will be 20 minutes here and the rest of the interview over on Brussels Signal, which is, by the way, also a fantastic medium I would like you to subscribe to. Now, today, I do something that's also new. This show will be divided into two pieces. So the first one is a little bit of a rehash, if you want, over the events of the last couple of days in the United Kingdom and also what it means for the broader West. But then I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the potential root causes. I want to talk about approaches that were particularly taken by Friedrich Nietzsche that I believe can explain a little bit what's going on. So if you're fed up by everything about this issue that you've seen on social media, that you've read in the news, that you've seen on X, please feel free to skip to the second half of this podcast, where I think there are some interesting details, some interesting perspectives that you have not yet seen in the media and their reporting. I still would ask you, and I hope that you bear with me for the full 40 minutes to get the bigger picture, but it's particularly the second half of today's podcast that I'm very, very proud of and that I'm very much looking forward to. Now, I want to begin with a short video clip from the 1970s, from 1971 to be precise, of Enoch Powell at a US show, the former member of parliament in the UK, who's famously known for his Rivers of Blood speech, and what he had to say about mass migration into the UK. So this would be media clip 1.
Because of the numbers. If the numbers were small, then of course, like any very small minority, they would filter into the population. But nobody seriously imagines that if 2/5 of Birmingham consists of a first generation of descendants born here, of people from the West Indies, from Africa, and from Asia, there will not be a profound difference between that part of the population and the rest.
I think there may be a difference. In fact, there certainly will be a difference. Whether that difference is enough to promote anxiety, unless someone declares...
You think nobody would notice?
No, I think they'll notice, certainly. The question about is whether they will notice with fear and horror, unless someone announces to them that fear and horror are appropriate response to such a fact.
I see. And you think that human nature is such that unless somebody referred to this, nobody would notice that their own native cities were transformed.
So what everyone thinks about Powell's position in general, I think he's absolutely right. A small number of migrants can always filter through into the general population and can be integrated, very often to such an extent that they can become even more dedicated to their new home, to the local customs, than the native population. Think about it very often historically. There are plenty of historical figures that were kind of converts, if you will, to their new home. Napoleon, right, was not technically born a Frenchman. Stalin, of course, a negative example, was somebody who was born in Georgia. You could even make the claim that the first American presidents were born Englishmen and not as Americans. So I think the place of birth is not necessarily an indicator of the loyalty to your home, the loyalty of the place where you live. Another picture I want to show you, which is from the time of the Habsburg Empire, is about the Emperor's Bosniaks. And what this picture shows you is that within the Habsburg Empire, the Muslims of the Balkans were seen as an elite unit within the imperial army. So they were very well integrated, they were respected both on the battlefield and among their comrades. Another thing I would like to show that many of you certainly know is the role of Muslims in World War I. Right? There's a significant number, 2.5 million Muslim soldiers and laborers from all over the world fought with the Allied forces, both with dignity and honor. Many of them are volunteers, and out of the British Indian Army, right, 400,000 members were Muslims. So there was not always this contention between the kind of Western populations and the Muslim population. And I think one reason why this was the case was because if we go back in time, if we look at the West in the 19th century and the very early beginnings of the 20th century, the West was a civilization with tremendous confidence in itself. Now, you might justifiably argue that this self-confidence or this overarching self-confidence was in the end one of the reasons for the West's downfall, or the potential downfall of the West, if we have a more optimistic bent. But nonetheless, if you're a confidence culture, if you're a confidence civilization, people will want to integrate into that civilization because you're perceived as superior, you're perceived as the winning team, you're perceived as worthwhile integrating into. And I think this is what happened for a long time. The entire world, in a sense, partially voluntarily, partially involuntarily, tried to integrate into the Western worldview. As I said, like, we can discuss in greater detail whether this was a good thing or whether this was a bad thing, or when Mahatma Gandhi was once asked what he thinks of Western civilization, if I recall correctly, his answer was something along the lines that it could have been a good idea. And I think there is some truth to this, but it was seen as kind of the most dominant civilization, and therefore people wanted to integrate into it. And that's a crucial element, because as this confidence is getting lost, or as we lose this backbone, this trust in our own values, in our own traditions, in our own culture, it is also increasingly difficult to integrate people into that culture. And what is happening, and this is what Enoch Powell has been alluding to, is if you have now a culture that is internally getting weaker, and at the same time you have massive migration from the outside, the kind of clashes, the kind of conflicts we see now in the United Kingdom, we see in parts of continental Europe, even though there is significantly less reporting about it, is almost a logical consequence of it. And I want to make very clear that we should not get trapped in looking at the symptoms and mistake them for the causes. There's a lot of debates on individuals like Tommy Robinson or Lawrence Fox, or this individual here or this individual there. But I think they're all symptoms of something that was bound to happen at some point anyways, because this class of cultures within Western civilization was something that was bound to happen. Now, we see other cultures and other civilizations that struggle with similar problems. Look at Japan, for example, but they don't have mass migration. So this is one of the reasons why you don't see that kind of conflict in Japan. But of course, otherwise you see similar phenomena there, even though Japan per se is not necessarily part of Western culture. So this problem of an exhaustion of a civilization is not just something that happens to the West. It is something that can happen to all cultures. I would argue that a couple of centuries back, it happened to Islamic civilization. I would argue that it happened to Roman civilization. I think this is not necessarily a phenomenon that is entirely new or that's exclusive to the West. I think the only question is it going to be lethal? Is it going to be the end of Western civilization? Or is there a power, is there a possibility of renewal? And this is something that we'll have to look into in greater detail. Now, another element we have to talk about is that numbers don't lie. And something that was prepared, if you look at the kind of the white population of Britain on this picture in 1971, right, it kind of shows quite clearly that 93.9% were white. Now, to be very clear, to be kind of to avoid any kind of criticism, skin color does not determine culture, but it is a proxy. I think this is an important thing. So there's absolutely no reason to believe that just because somebody is white or somebody is black or somebody is brown, that this automatically means that they hold specific views, that they have specific attitudes. But it's a proxy, right? I think there's the likelihood, for example, of finding certain attitudes among a specific ethnic part of the population is higher than among others. So this is something that serves as a proxy. Now, if we say that in 1971, 93.9% of England and Wales were white, and now we switch to the next graph that shows us England in 2021, there we see that this number has went down to 74.4%. So almost a reduction of 20 percentage points. obviously, what this tells us is there is something going on in the United Kingdom. A demographic shift is happening. We have very reliable numbers that the very limited population growth that is still taking place in the UK, and again, this is also true for other European countries, a lot of this comes almost exclusively from migration. And if you look, as Neil Ferguson has written about this very insightful in his book Civilization that came out a couple of years back, that given current demographic patterns, by 2050, 2060, 2070, right, the Muslim population of Britain is moving ever closer to 50 or above 50%. Now, one can argue that's nothing, right? Why should we care about this? But I think the last couple of weeks have shown why we should care about this. So something is going on. And this has been going on, I would argue, since the 1970s, which is why I played this clip of Enoch Powell at the beginning. Because he, for all the flaws he might have, he was warning of this development in 1971. And I find this is a crucial observation for a very simple reason. Because it shows you that many of the potential culprits, and I'm not saying that they don't play a role in this as well, don't get me wrong, but I think the idea that a lot of this has been pushed by quote-unquote new organizations like the World Economic Forum, or there's an argument that it's the Russians who are behind it, and all these different ideas and concepts and institutions that, again, no doubt that are also pushing for this. But I think they jumped on a bandwagon that did already exist. So if you look, for example, at the positions taken by somebody like George Soros, he did not come up with those ideas. Those ideas have existed before, right? This is, again, what Enoch Powell is alluding to, and but also the interlocutor of Powell in that video clip, right? You can see the kind of befuddled face, the very idea that there should be a difference in culture and behavior in the organization of a society if they come from different places in the world. So I think the problem we're dealing with is much older than we are sometimes willing to admit in the public debate. Of course, it's also important, I want to make this very clear, multiple causalities, multiple reasons are possible. It doesn't have to be just one thing, and this is also something I'm going to talk about in greater detail a little bit later in today's show. Now, another thing I want to show you, because I think this is equally important, the reason why I was talking about Muslim soldiers for the Allies in World War I and World War II, the reason I was mentioning the Muslim troops fighting for Austria-Hungary in World War I, is because there is also a segment of the migrant population that in itself suffers very, very strongly from mass migration. So there is this depiction that is very seductive, I believe, for both the left and the right, to say there's the quote-unquote native population, if you want, or the population that has been in a given country for generations, and then there are the newcomers. And these are like two solid blocks that stand next to each other, or in the worst case, they stand against each other. But I don't think this is true, right? I think you have, even within the block of the native-born population for generations, right, you have elements, which is, I guess, best described as the woke element, who is against this block, right? So who are against British culture, Western culture, American culture, German culture. And at the same time, within the block of the migrants, right, you have a significant number of people who admire Western civilization, who want to integrate into Western civilization, who want to be part of the new home. And I think this is going to be the big challenge for the future, because those of us, like I'm sure that you do and as I do, who believe in the value and in the necessity to continue Western civilization, like, there are allies and enemies, right, on both sides of the aisle. And I think we have to be very careful not to get sucked into the simplicity to believe that, again, certain, for example, as I said, skin color or even religion, in every single case is a determinant of where that individual stands in this struggle. So I think this is very, very crucial. And I can give you another example from Germany, another graph I have prepared. Again, this was made by Paul Vanitas, who does great work in this. Now, what you can see here are reading skills among 15-year-old students in Germany, both by immigration status and the year. And what you can see is that while it's a normal straight line from the native Germans that is now starting to decline, there was an uptick in reading skills among migrants. So what this showed you that for a while, between 2000 and 2012, integration actually in some areas, at least in education, showed to take a little bit of hold, right? Language skills improved, so there was, I think, justifiably some hope. But then starting in 2013, and of course then particularly in 2015, you see a decline, right? You see a decline in first generation migrants and then second generation migrants. So what we see happening is that this wave of mass migration is not just harming the quote-unquote native population, it's also harming the migrant population that wants to integrate. So they are also victims in this scenario, and I think among them there are many that are allies, because what I believe, and which I hope that you do as well, is that for all the let's call it biological, ethical factors that certainly do exist, at the end of the day, culture is a choice. The values you adhere to are a choice. The way in which you identify the civilization you want to see as the one you aspire to is a choice. Right? There is absolutely no need for somebody who is brown, black, white, you name it, and to say that because of my skin color, because of certain genetic markers, if you want, I have to subscribe to a specific belief system. I do not think that's the case. Very often, as I said before, there is overlap, right? As we said before. So as a proxy for statistical reasons, I believe that sometimes this can be helpful. But in every single case, this must not necessarily be the perfect way to figure out where a person stands. And I think this is very, very crucial in this situation and in this conversation. But, and this is the crucial point, if you want people, both those who have been here for generations and those who just arrived, if you want them to integrate, you need to offer them something to integrate into. There is no way to beat something with nothing. And even more importantly, people will not integrate into a culture that is perceived as weak, in a culture that is perceived as jelly-spined, in a culture that seems to not believe in itself anymore. So I want to show you this headline from the Berliner Zeitung in Germany. And this was a suggestion by the German Union of Police Officers, and I'm going to read it to you because I find it quite remarkable. Anyone who hands in banned knives should be rewarded with a Netflix subscription. So this is the idea, because in Germany, the number of knife crimes continues to rise, a phenomenon, again, we see in the United Kingdom, we see in Germany, we see everywhere where mass migration has taken place. But kind of instead of clamp down on those who are behind this increase in knife crimes, and pretty much every statistic tells us who the culprits are. The idea is to kind of back them and say, oh, please, can't you hand in your knives and you get a Netflix subscription in exchange? Now, it would be funny if it wouldn't be so sad, because what this shows to others is weakness. Now, once again, imagine you're the parent of a young immigrant and you want to educate your son, in particular the sons, to integrate into that civilization, to that culture. And you say, and you want to tell them how to behave, to not participate in crime, not participate in violence. And then you see the society in which you're supposed to integrate. They come to you on their knees and say, please, don't do us any harm. You get a Netflix account, and you get this, and you get a social worker assigned, and you get all these different kinds of things. If you are being perceived as weak, you will be taken advantage of. Donald Rumsfeld once had this famous line that weakness is a provocation. Now, that is true in international politics, but it's also true in domestic politics, right? If you show weakness towards those whom you want to integrate, they simply will not integrate. And this is precisely what we see happening. And I'm not talking about kind of brutality here, but there must be a clear hierarchy. And this is something that all politicians shy away from. There must be a clear hierarchy that within a country there is a dominant culture. This culture might decide to tolerate values that are different from their own. They might decide to be open-minded in some areas, but this is something that is granted by the dominant culture to other cultures. And if these other cultures, or if members of these other cultures seem to abuse that tolerance, then that tolerance can either be restricted or revoked. This, of course, means also that there is a specific obligation on the members of other cultures to police themselves. So if, for example, what we saw happening, whether it's grooming camps in Rotherham, whether it's crime families in Germany, clans in Germany, whether it's what's happening in the French banlieues, right? Even if this is just a very small percentage of the migrant population, of the Muslim community, then that community is obliged, in my opinion at least, to police their own community, to make sure that these things are not happening. Because, as I said previously, and I will not shy away from saying this again, It is a tolerance that is brought by the native population towards the newcomers. If this tolerance is abused, then maybe the tolerance can be seen as a mistake. There's a reason why we don't have these conversations, for example, about Chinese immigrants, about Taiwanese immigrants, about Vietnamese immigrants, about immigrants from Buddhist countries, immigrants from Latin American countries. There is not a huge uptick, for example, in the United Kingdom against Catholics. So this is very clear that once there is the impression, the justified punishment, that tolerance is being abused, then you can no longer be tolerant. And this is, I believe, also what leads a bit to what is justifiably called two-tier policing. Kind of, we have been too soft on individuals, on groups that hold values that are directly opposed to our own. Talking about Catholicism, there is this headline that kind of caught my eye about the Irish and the English, and you see this on this next graph, which I find quite impressive, that at demonstrations in Dublin and Belfast, now you see Irish people waving both the Union Jack and the three colours of Ireland. Now, this is absolutely remarkable. Who would have thought a couple of decades back that you would see something like this? But I think even in Ireland, the people have realized that for all the differences between the British and the Irish, between the English and the Irish, that in this broader struggle, in this civilizational struggle, which I think it is, right, they are standing on the same side. Now, this does not mean that these conflicts between the British and the Irish cannot kind of flame up at any given moment again, but I think there is an understanding that the differences between the Brits and the Irish are smaller than the differences between, let's say, the Brits and mass migration from non-Western societies and non-Western cultures. And you see, of course, the impact of this and why people feel like this in what's also happening in Germany. Now, there has been this one case, the Bild-Zeitung reported it, and you can see it on the following picture, that and I'm just going to read it to you, that the family of knife perpetrator Khalil H. came to Germany from Syria to seek refuge. Since then, the Bild titles, it has made Germany more insecure. Almost the entire family, and I think it's about 13 people, they together have committed over 100 crimes. And this is something that neither Germans nor the British people understand. So somebody comes to your country, they ask both for asylum, they ask to be given refuge in your country, they ask for tolerance towards their way of life, they ask for participation in the welfare state. But at the same time, they feel no obligation to respect the laws and customs of the country they come to. And this is seen as unfair. This is seen as unjust. There is a sense in Germany, and there's also the same sense in the United Kingdom, that as a taxpayer, you increasingly pay for those who work actively on the destruction of social cohesion, of community, of your society. And I think that perception is true. Now, again, does that mean that every single migrant falls into this category? Of course not. But how much does it take? And this is exactly what we see. How many sparks does it take to blow up a powder keg? Not that many. So this idea that, oh my God, it's just a small minority, I don't think that this argument really cuts it anymore. Because it is a broader issue and something that we'll get to in greater detail. As I said, the problem is, on the one hand, with different belief systems, let's say with non-Western belief systems. But the other problem is that we ourselves have lost trust and confidence in our belief systems. Look at this graph that was published by the Wall Street Journal, and it's about the percentage who say these values are very important to them. And this is astounding. This is from the United States, but I have other countries as well, so bear with me. In the late 1990s, over 60% of Americans said that patriotism is a very important value for them. By 2023, this dropped to under 40%. In 1998, about 50% said that religion is very important to them. This has dropped to about 40%. Having children, from more than 50%, dropped to slightly over 20%. And I think for me, the most important value here is community involvement has dropped from 45% to about 20%. And the only thing that increased in importance is having money. And this, of course, is something that makes it very difficult to hold a country together, to hold a society together. But we see this in other countries as well. When we ask the question, how patriotic are countries, we see that Thailand is very patriotic. The United States, still kind of. China, very patriotic, but then when you look at Great Britain, Australia, like those who call themselves very patriotic, falls to 30%, 20%, 23%, and the last ones are Germans, where only 9% of Germans say that patriotism is very important for them, and 37% say it's significantly important to them. But overall, what these numbers show you that the further you go to the West, with the exception of the United States, the less patriotic the people become. And again, this makes a lot of sense, I believe, and I will go into greater detail just in a couple of minutes. I just want to show you two more graphs. One is about patriotism in the United Kingdom, as I said, because the United Kingdom is the major issue that I want to talk about today. And what you see is that the patriotism that's still around is mostly carried by the generation of the 40 to 60 plus year old. The younger the people get, the less patriotic are they, the less interested are they in their own country. And you see something similar in another graph I've prepared about the Netherlands, because I also want to show you that this is something that takes place across Western civilization, across Western culture, and it's not just a British, German, or American phenomenon. And even there you see, if you look in the year 2022, who would be willing to fight for the Netherlands by age bracket? And it turns out that the 60 plus and the 45 to 59 year olds, they're kind of over 50% of them are willing to fight for their country. The 30 to 44 year olds, slightly less, but still close to 50%. And then you look at the 18 to 29 year olds, it's less than 50%. So in a sense, you could argue that whatever Gen Z is, at the moment at least, they are not a patriotic generation. They are not a nationalist generation. And again, you might say, well, this is a great thing, isn't that? I mean, isn't it awesome that they're open-minded, cosmopolitan, they no longer believe in the importance of the nation, they believe in the world, everything is taking place on a global scale? Maybe, but I think that's not really what's going on here. I don't think that you can simply exchange loyalty to your local community with loyalty to some imagined global community. And this brings me to kind of the conclusion, the most important part of today's podcast. Like this is now we are coming to the part where I said you can jump to this part if you want to skip the first half. Now I begin with an unlikely quote by Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden once said that when people see a strong horse and a weak horse, by nature they will like the strong horse. And I think there is a lot to that. And what bin Laden was saying, and again, I say this as somebody who does not admire bin Laden. I know there was for a while this trend on TikTok where young people were kind of all in awe about bin Laden's letter to America. But I think this shows you again that if you have to admire the person that wants to destroy your country, you're probably the weak horse and not the strong horse. But I think he gets something right. He gets right, as Rumsfeld correctly pointed out, if weakness is a provocation, then strength is seductive. And I think this is what we see once again if you look at the different communities in the West. If one community is perceived as being strong, is perceived as being on the rise, is perceived as being confident, it will be attractive to young people. I believe, for example, that Islam in particular is no longer just attractive to second, third, or first generation immigrants. I think it will get increasingly attractive to the native population as well, because it is seen as a confident, strong form of identity. So I think many of the problems within the Muslim community will spill over in the non-Muslim community as well. We know, if you look to Scotland, again, same in Germany, if you have a marriage between a Muslim and a non-Muslim, the likelihood of the non-Muslim converting to the Islamic faith is significantly higher than the other way around, because one belief has confidence, has a backbone, and the other one doesn't. And now I want to take a look at why this is the case. And since I don't want to take credit for somebody else's idea, I want to show you the cover of, in my opinion, one of the most important but not enough talked about books by Stephen B. Smith. It's called Modernity and Its Discontents, and it's about the making and unmaking of the bourgeois from Machiavelli to Bellow. Stephen B. Smith is a Yale historian. I consider him one of the most important thinkers of our age. I have an entire podcast episode with him, which I will also upload on my channel after this. I think it's a very interesting conversation you will enjoy. And in this book, again, I cannot recommend it enough, it's called Modernity and Its Discontents. And in this book, he has a very interesting chapter on Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, I know, kind of Nietzsche is all the rage these days, and you see, kind of from I think from the Brass Age pervert to all others, the idea that we live in a Nietzschean age is very popular these days. So this is something that we hear all the time. But I believe that a lot of focus when it comes to Nietzsche is put on the wrong aspects of his writing, because one of the things that Nietzsche pointed out, and I want to get into today, is the way in which he was talking about history. I think one of the things that Nietzsche understood more than others, and we can talk about the details in a minute, but that he understood better than others, is that the human condition is not primarily defined by truth, but it's also defined by myth. And he had this great, and this is clip 16. This is one piece out of Smith's book, and I think this is a fantastic point that he makes. So Smith takes a quote here from Nietzsche, which goes as follows: "I hate everything that merely instructs me without augmenting or directly invigorating my activity." This is the quote, and then Smith goes on to say, "Nietzsche's point is that knowledge, chiefly including historical knowledge, must be evaluated not only in terms of truth and falsity, but also in terms of its influence on life, on how we live. His history is of value only if it serves or enhances the life of action." And I think what Nietzsche means by this, and I think what Smith summarizes so nicely, is that it's not just important to know what objectively historically happened. We have to look at how the way in which we interpret history is affecting us today. So if, for example, you tell history in a way that Western civilization is the worst of the worst, and that we are responsible for all the bad things happening in the world, this is not just, I would say it's not at all objective, and I come to this in a second, but it's not just an unobjective way of history, but it's not just a treatment of the past. It immediately morphs into a treatment of the present, because you derive a moral obligation from the way in which you describe your history. If you say that our history is one of criminal behavior, then by default we are supposed to do atonement for this. And this is coming back to something that you saw probably out in the media recently. And this is, I think, is underlying, for example, this idea of two-tier policing. There is a sense that we cannot punish those who violate our values, because supposedly our values have been so bad that they deserve being opposed, that they deserve being violated. And this is, I think, one of the bigger issues. And Nietzsche kind of gets to the matter, gets to the heart of things on this area. On picture 17, and then Smith continues, which I think in a quite equally interesting part, when Nietzsche says, and this is again a quote, "This is a universal law. A living thing can only be healthy, strong, and fruitful when bounded by a horizon." And what Nietzsche means by horizon is that a community, a society, they need something to strive to. They need a myth, a legend to keep them together. And this dovetails nicely what I showed you before. If you no longer believe in patriotism, in community, in religion, in the things that have determined the course of your community for centuries, then the future just becomes so much less important. You live, as Goethe says in the second part of Faust, you live only in the present tense. You have no interest in future generations anymore. There is nothing worth living for. And you can see this, of course, also in the example I gave you from Germany. So there's this idea that violence can be solved if you just give people a Netflix account, if you just give them something so that they can entertain themselves unto death, without understanding, I would argue, that in many ways, of course, Islam, but also identities, other ideologies as well, is a form of protest against that present tense culture. Now, to be very clear, I don't share that kind of protest. It's not my kind of protest. But I think that's an element that we entirely underestimate. That even in the realm, let's say, of transgenderism, in all these different bits and pieces, we see spirituality, you name it. This is there's a sense within Western civilization that this present tense culture is not enough, that living just in the moment is not enough. But we have a hard difficulty in diagnosing it, because it's also seductive, right? If nothing else matters anymore, if you live in a polyamorous relationship, you have no children, there's nothing for the future generations to to build, and if you can kind of numb yourself with entertainment, both in the material kind, but also in the sensual kind, right? Of course, then it's very easy to forget about the need to sacrifice for a future. And this is something that Nietzsche, I think, gets to quite nicely. In this way, what Nietzsche does, and this is what I think is the most underappreciated part of it, is that Nietzsche claims that we are not just political animals, as Aristotle told us. He says we are also historical animals. We are bound by history. And this is something that what he means by this is that, and we do this, we look back and forth. On the one hand, we are a very individualistic society, but at the same time, we still draw obligations, we still draw rights, we still draw many concepts and ideas from a shared historical past. It's a paradox, but I think it's an important paradox. And the view of history for Nietzsche determines how a society moves forward. It's very similar to the saying of George Orwell, who once says, "Those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future." And I think this was just Orwell's way to describe something that Nietzsche points to when he talks about three kinds of history. And this is what I want to get into. I want to look at these three kinds of history that Nietzsche is talking about, because they give us a very good description of what is going on. So Nietzsche distinguishes between monumental history, antiquarian history, and critical history. And I believe that all three of these concepts help us to understand what's currently going on in the Western world. Monumental history is, as the word gives away, is looking at history as an inspiration. You look for heroes who are models for conduct, right? We look at heroes as individuals who you want to aspire to, whether it's Moses or whether it's somebody like Napoleon maybe, or somebody like George Washington. Oh, it's and almost you shroud the past in mystery, in myth. It's not objectively true, and this is something that Nietzsche very well knows. He's aware of. He says monumental history is an elevation of the past in order to draw inspiration for the present. And he says it. He has this wonderful phrase about what he calls seductive simplicities. And let me give you this quote from Nietzsche. It entices the courageous to foolhardiness, and the inspired to fanaticism. And this is something we have seen historically time and again. We saw it in the West, we saw it in Islamic culture, we see it in contemporary in Chinese culture. This idea that you take a mythical past, and from that mythical past you take an obligation how to act towards the future. And very often this mythical past is of course distorted from objective reality. But as Nietzsche points out, you need this kind of myth, because it gives you, as I mentioned before, it gives you a horizon. Because if you believe that there have been these great individuals in the past, as I said, a living thing can only be healthy, strong, and fruitful when bounded by a horizon. So if there's something worth aspiring to, and even if the source, the inspiration of that aspiration comes from a past that is not entirely real, right, it still invigorates you, as Nietzsche says, and that's what he's interested in. Nietzsche doesn't say that objective history does not exist, but he says he's interested in history as how it affects us today and how it will affect us tomorrow. And I think this is a crucial thing. So we need this kind of monumental history. So, and you see this nowadays, right? So was Winston Churchill a perfect individual? Probably not. But can he still serve as an inspiration? Absolutely. Right? There are many historical figures that the deeper you drill, the more you know about them, the less heroic they might seem. But if we entirely lose the belief that there ever have been heroes, that there ever have been individuals that were quote-unquote larger than life, then it's also an excuse for us not to aspire to more than our mere existence. And there have been historical incidences, and I posted this graph a couple of weeks ago. I do not have it with me today, unfortunately. When you look at survival rates, for example, at the Titanic, right, there you can see that, in fact, the value of children and women first was, for the larger part, upheld. Survival rates were significantly higher among children and women than they were for men. And this, I think, was a Nietzschean moment, if you want. This idea that even though it might cost me my own life, the highest sacrifice possible, you're willing to do it, to give it, because that was the social norm, an almost Nietzschean norm, if you want. He then goes on to talk about the second kind of history that exists, so-called antiquarian history. And this, Nietzsche says, belongs to those who preserves and reveres, who looks back to where he has come into being with love and loyalty. So it's again, you look back into history and you see it in a way that whatever happened, it led up to this moment in a revering, in a way of kindness. This kind of history, Smith writes, Nietzsche averse serves the needs of the less favored generation and peoples by anchoring them firmly in their past and thus protecting them from the fruitless search for novelty and ever new sources of stimulation. Now this is right. Again, Nietzsche is very shrewd. Nietzsche does not really say that one way to look at history is better than the other. But what he does realize is that there is, of course, also a danger in just looking back, because then it kind of frees you from doing something differently, from doing something new, right? You could think about, let's say, slavery in the antebellum South, right? What they call the peculiar institution. So you have a horrible habit of holding slaves, but then you look back and say, well, it has been done like this for such a long time. So it kind of frees you then from doing something about it, and it doesn't allow you to change. And this is the dilemma that Nietzsche has realized so well, that between being open for change, but at the same time for seeing the value in preserving something. And this is, of course, a dilemma that every society has to work with and has to react to. But now let me come to which I believe is the most important one, for us at least, of his three histories. And that's what he calls critical history. And here's the description that Nietzsche gives us of the critical historian. He says, the critical historian must have the strength to break up and dissolve a part of the past by, and this is the key sentence, by scrupulously examining it and finally condemning it. And I think this is the key part of what we have to struggle with nowadays. That everybody these days wants to be a critical thinker. And I think Nietzsche would laugh at the idea, or at least he would be worried about the idea of everybody being a critical thinker. Because as he says, that being a critical thinker in Nietzschean terms, when it comes to history at least, is not just that you dissolve the myths of the past, that you look under the hood, if you will, that you no longer, like the antiquarian historian, kind of looks back in a kind of loving and affectionate way, that you really want to see the warts and all. But the end point of this, according to Nietzsche, is that finally you will end up condemning your own history. And this is precisely the situation the West finds itself in at the moment. This is, in my opinion, I hope we can discuss this in greater detail in the future, that at the heart of the problems that we have both in economic terms, with migration, and in cultural terms, is that the West has declared war on its own history. Everybody is a critical historian in the Nietzschean terms. And as he says, let me just read this again, that after examining it, the next stage is condemning it. And think about, for example, the BLM riots, right? That was full of spray painting statues, or the tearing down of statues, or the desecrating of monuments, all these kind of things. This is in real life doing what Nietzsche was anticipating, what Nietzsche was worrying about. And he says, he goes on, like this is as Smith describes Nietzsche's idea. Critical history has no problem with uprooting the sources of tradition or calling the authority of heroes into question. Right? So Winston Churchill, oh, what a horrible human being. George Washington, slaveholder. Thomas Jefferson, no, don't even get me started. So this is precisely this. Right? So you look at the figures, the heroes of the past that have been an inspiration for so long, that now you say, oh, they were not just not that great. In fact, they were horrible human beings. Now, what this, of course, also does, it elevates yourself. So it's no longer, as Nietzsche would say, and in the past no longer is that the foundation for an invigorating horizon worthwhile aspiring to. It becomes the opposite. It is something you have to detach yourself from. And in fact, you are much greater than they were in the past. So you don't have to live up to their model, if you want. On the contrary, right? Because you are so much better they are, because you don't just have examined them, you have condemned them. And I would argue that at the heart of everything, this is also at the core of wokeness. Now, you could argue that the same thing is also at the core of Marxism, and I think that is correct. But even Marxism, I would argue, is a symptom of this phenomenon that Nietzsche was describing. So wokeness is not necessarily a kind of Marxism in disguise. I would just say that wokeness is just as Marxism, an outgrowth of this quote-unquote critical history. And that's absolutely important, because a society that lives entirely of condemning its own past cannot survive. And it can particularly not survive because the argument, as we see now, if you have, and this is why I showed you the graph before of the United Kingdom, if you have an ever-growing part of your population that is no longer born in Britain, so the need for integration becomes ever more important. But then you want to integrate them into a society, into a social contract, that the people that have been born there no longer believe in themselves. How is that supposed to work? So you want to raise a new generation of immigrants. You want to kind of morph them, turn them into British patriots. But at the same time, you're no longer a patriot yourself. You no longer believe in your own history. You condemn your own history. You see it as something entirely negative. Then integration cannot work. It cannot function. And there was a time when it did work. But this was a time when we were, let's say, more in the realm of the monumental and antiquarian history, and not the critical history. And Nietzsche says this. Now, let me give you another sentence as Smith describes it. The problem with critical history is that it can destroy but cannot create. It can cut through and expose the falsehoods, myths, and illusions on which previous cultures have been based, but cannot produce the ideals by which cultures can live and thrive. Critical history, like modern science and scholarship more generally, has a negative effect on culture. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Right? That the way in which we treat history, the way in which we treat modern scholarship, is at odds with the concept of culture as Nietzsche would have described it. So this is the problem. So we want to integrate people into quote-unquote Western culture. But we no longer even know what culture is. Right? Alan Bloom, in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, is also referring to Nietzsche, and he talks about this idea that culture is where the argument stops. Right? Culture is it's certain values that you no longer put up for debate. But if you no longer believe in such a thing, all of a sudden everything is up for debate. Or as Nietzsche would have called it, right, you would be in the re-evaluation of all values. And this is why I believe that while we have to focus on the symptoms, we have to look at these underlying root causes. Let me give another example, because a lot of conversations in the media are about this. I think it looks now that 2 biological males will be the finalists in the Olympic boxing games. Right? And they say, okay, this is just a fad, this is just maybe a form of decadence or something. But it also falls into this category of what Nietzsche is talking about, because the critical examination and ultimately the condemnation is not just about the larger-than-life historical figures. It's also about things that came absolutely natural to us, like there are men and there are women. But if everything of the past is bad, if everything that we have built, every pillar of our culture is to be first to be examined and then to be destroyed, it will not stop at such ideas as I just mentioned, that men are men or women are women. All of a sudden say, well, maybe that's not the cause either. So all this, I believe, derives from this Nietzschean idea of how we have to look at history. Right? He calls it the use and disuse or abuse of history. And so many of the things that seem separate today, like as I said, riots in the UK, transgenderism at the Olympic Games, all these different things, I think they can be tied together under this umbrella of what you can call it the dominance of the Nietzschean critical historical approach. So what can we do about it? As a conversation started, maybe the concluding remark for today. I think we have to develop in the West a certain openness, and what I mean by this in a second, an openness to that myths are not a bad thing. Yes, we know that Great Britain was not perfect, and the United Kingdom was not perfect, and Europe was not perfect. But I would still argue that in the larger scheme of things, these civilizations were pretty good. Now, I do not begrudge it anybody from China if they look at their civilization in the same way. I do not begrudge it anybody from Islam if they look at their civilization the same way. But I think it is unnecessary, and it has to stop, that we constantly find virtue in declaring our entire history just to be entirely consisting of vices. And this is where we are. Nobody denies the crimes. Nobody denies the problems. But I believe that if you marinate a generation in hatred of their own history, not only will these people turn against their own history and their own culture and civilization, those who come to your country and maybe at one point wanted to integrate and wanted to become part of that civilization, they will turn their back on your civilization as well. Because you cannot expect somebody to believe in something that you yourself no longer believe in. And this is going to be a topic that will stay with us for a longer time. Please leave your comments wherever you find appropriate. Again, this was a very condensed form to talk about a larger philosophical topic, but I will return to this more often, because I think at the end of the day, this is a philosophical cultural problem. Everything that we see happening at the moment is not a financial problem. It's not a purely economic problem. And my fear is that as so often, politics will only try to throw money at it. But this is indeed a culture war, right? This is the true culture war that we are seeing. It's between those who subscribe to critical history and those who subscribe to monumental history. In an ideal world, we would have bits and pieces of both. But at the moment, there is a significant bias towards critical history, and we need a little bit more of monumental history as well. This is it for today. I'm looking very much forward to seeing, listening, or I hope that you are looking forward to seeing and listening to me again next week, and I'll see you in the comments. Thank you very much.